Hi, I'm going to talk about my digital tools lesson plan for iTech 7430. I created a project for my ninth grade algebra students called Data Crunchers. I really love using data as a real world application of mathematics because students often have a really hard time finding the why. Why am I learning this? Why is this math important to me? And data is a really easy place to allow students to explore real life applications of mathematics. So, in my Data Crunchers project, the students were asked if there's a relationship between two things. I gave them several sample questions, and I even allowed them to use the sample questions or I allowed them to create their own question. Then they were asked to collect real world data to try and answer their question. Is there a relationship between height and shoe size? Is there a relationship between the number of calories you eat and your weight? Is there a relationship between the number of hours you sleep and your grades in your classes? Students then had to uh, collect their data and calculate statistical measures from their data. Then they had to draw conclusions from their data based on their statistical evidence. And then they also were being asked to gain confidence using online tools to complete the above tasks. I didn't let them do anything paper pencil. They had to pick digital tools to use to create professional presentations, which allowed them experience in creating something that they were proud of. And they didn't have to have artistic ability to make it look nice. They just had to be able to use their resources. The rubric that I gave them was very specific and allowed them a chance to know exactly at each step what was expected of them and how many points they were going to get for meeting those. Did they ask an appropriate question? Did they collect data using a technology tool? Did they use their data to create a scatter plot? Did they use their scatter plot to create an accurate line of best fit? Did they find their correlation coefficient using that technology? Students are demonstrating their understanding of what does that correlation coefficient mean? What is it going to tell them about their data? They had to understand what their slope and y-intercept meant in context. They also had to use some sort of a presentation technology tool to create a final product that allowed me to know that they had demonstrated that understanding. I gave them several options, but I also let them choose from any that they would like. Um, did they draw conclusions that were appropriate based on their data? And did they justify their conclusions appropriately based on their correlation coefficient? So that was the rubric that they got. They also received questions for me to answer at the end, and I kind of tailored those questions to each student based on the question they asked in their data survey. So that was a little bit difficult going through trying to make sure that the question lined up with what the student's question was. So that took a little bit of finagling on my end. So after we went over the rubric, then the students were given options. Okay, they had to clear their question with me. So before anybody created any type of survey that they were going to share out with their classmates and their peers, because they had to get a certain number of data responses, and it was more than just in our classroom, so that it wasn't the same group of students answering the same question every time. So I made them get 50 um, data points, which is a lot, but since they were allowed to use technology, they were mandated to use technology to analyze their data. Having that number of data points wasn't extremely difficult for them. Um, I suggested using either Google Forms or SurveyMonkey to them to collect their data from their peers. But I also told them that if there was some other method that they wanted to go about, I even told them that they could use an Instagram poll if they wanted to use their social media outside of school. Obviously, they couldn't do that in the building because there are firewalls don't allow it. But um, I showed them how to use Google Forms appropriately, um, how to, when they created their new form, create their two questions that then um, were the appropriate type of question. They didn't need a multiple choice question, they needed an open response question so that they could collect those data points and put them together. So they needed to ask two questions. They needed to title their form with the question so that people knew what they were asking for. And then I also showed them how to get their responses and analyze their responses based on what they got. I also ran through how to create a SurveyMonkey with them. That's nice and easy to share out with a link. It'll load. So, Google Forms was easy because we're a Google school and they don't have to log into anything. They don't have to sign up for anything. SurveyMonkey allows them to sign in with Google also. So nice and seamless. And then they just had to create their survey here in SurveyMonkey. I didn't have very many students stray away from Google Forms or SurveyMonkey just because they're not as familiar with these kinds of tools. So they didn't have one that they loved that they were going to use. The second online tool that we used was Desmos. I did not allow students other options for this because the graphing calculator on Desmos is what the calculator is on their state testing. It's on their summative assessments in my class. It's the calculator that we use throughout the year. And as they continue on through the higher level maths, they will also continue to use Desmos. So I did not give them a secondary option for Desmos. They had to use Desmos. So in Desmos, they had to enter their data, and I have a sample data set here. So they had to enter their data and they had to create a scatter plot. So then I showed them how to save or snip this scatter plot. They had to add labels to their axes, and I made my x-axis height and I made my y-axis shoe size. So I showed them how to appropriately create their labels so that they would be visible on their graph, which I think I'm going the wrong way here. And then after they created their scatter plot, gave me the labels, and they could also label their scatter plot in their presentation without putting the labels into Desmos. They can create text box in their presentations. Then they had to create their linear regression model, which they are familiar with. And then they had to show me their line of best fit. They had to write their equation of their line of best fit. They had to get their correlation coefficient. And then they had to understand what that correlation coefficient meant. So using this tool was not, not an option because it's the one they have to use and it's the one they have to be familiar with. So this was just an exercise in how to create that visual, how to zoom, in and out appropriately based on what the data is. I am going to leave. Okay, the third part of their tool was to find a tool that created a presentation. So they could use Google Slides. Again, nice and easy to use because we're a Google school. They don't have to sign into anything. They don't have to do anything special there. Lots of them love to use Canva. I like to use Canva sometimes. So I allowed them to use Canva. They really love Prezi and the ins and the outs, and the kind of makes me a little dizzy, but I allowed that. Also, I also gave them the option of WeVideo, which I have learned to love in editing and making kind of interactive videos so that it's not just a boring presentation. The other tool that my kids used that I was not familiar with and I have never used was Powtoon, and that was pretty cool to see them use and kind of troubleshoot with them as they went through. But most of the kids stuck to what my suggestions were. All in all, the project went really well. The students really met the expectations. Some of them exceeded them. And students were successful at learning how to use the tools, making the tools work for what their data was, and using that data to mean something to them in the real world. They were very engaged in it, and it was a meaningful assignment. The one thing that was challenging for me during this was that I had, scheduled time each day during the project to meet with students so I could do a quick check-in, quick temperature check to make sure that they were in the right spot for the day that we were on, that they were not having any issues that they needed help with, and that they didn't need any redirecting. That took a lot longer than I anticipated. So in the future, I'm going to have to adjust how I do that and kind of figure out a better way to check in with students, because that was very challenging to meet in a 90-minute class period. So I will have to adjust minimally to use in the future. And I learned some new tools to use with students, including Powtoon.